The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence's house as Camilla stood before her ornate mirror, carefully applying her signature red lipstick. She had perfected this routine over decades, each stroke deliberate and precise, much like the carefully constructed image she presented to the world. Today was particularly important, the annual charity gala where she would once again play the role of the devoted royal consort, the woman who had supposedly transformed from controversial figure to beloved queen. What Camilla didn't know was that her world was about to crumble in the most spectacular way possible. Prince William sat in his study at Kensington Palace, staring at the documents spread across his mahogany desk. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of something between disbelief and dark amusement. The private investigator's report lay open before him, its contents more damning than he could have imagined. For months, whispers had circulated about Camilla's past, about inconsistencies in her stories, about fabricated charitable works and exaggerated accomplishments. But this was beyond anything he had expected. The report detailed a web of lies so intricate, so carefully woven over the years, that William found himself almost impressed by the audacity. Camilla had not just bent the truth. She had created an entirely fictional version of herself. Her supposed charitable work in Africa during the 1990s, completely fabricated. Her claims about supporting various causes during her first marriage, lies backed up by forged documents and paid testimonials. Even her stories about her relationship with his father had been embellished to paint herself in a more favorable light. William picked up his phone and scrolled through the evidence. Photographs that had been doctored, certificates that had been forged, witnesses who had been paid to corroborate false stories. The woman who had married his father and now wore his mother's crown had built her entire royal identity on deception. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Harry entered, his face grim. "You've seen it then," Harry said, noticing the papers on the desk. The brothers had maintained a strained relationship in recent years, but this revelation had brought them together with surprising unity. "All of it," William replied, leaning back in his chair. "The question is what we do now." Harry moved closer to the desk, his eyes scanning the documents. "She's been playing this game for decades, William, making herself look like the misunderstood woman who finally found her place in the royal family. All those interviews about how hard it was to find acceptance, how she had to prove herself worthy, it was all theater." William nodded slowly. The irony wasn't lost on him. Camilla had spent years cultivating sympathy, positioning herself as someone who had overcome public scrutiny to earn her place. She had carefully crafted narratives about her dedication to duty, her genuine love for charitable causes, her deep commitment to supporting his father. Every story had been designed to rehabilitate her image from the woman who had been blamed for his parents' marriage breakdown to a respected member of the royal family. "The timing couldn't be better," William said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Tonight's gala will have every major figure in the charity world, all the media, everyone who has praised her transformation over the years." Harry raised an eyebrow. "You're planning something." "I'm planning to let the truth speak for itself," William replied. "But, yes, I think tonight would be an appropriate time for some clarification." Meanwhile, across London, the investigative journalist Sarah Mitchell was putting the finishing touches on what she knew would be the story of her career. She had been working on the Camilla exposé for over a year, following leads that had initially seemed too outrageous to be true. But, as she dug deeper, interviewing former staff members who had been sworn to secrecy, tracking down records that had been carefully hidden, and following paper trails that led to some very interesting financial arrangements, a picture had emerged of systematic deception on a scale that even she found shocking. Sarah had built her reputation on fearless reporting, but even she had hesitated when she first began to uncover the extent of Camilla's fabrications. The implications were staggering. If her findings were accurate, it meant that the current queen consort had essentially constructed a false identity to gain acceptance into the royal family and British society. The evidence was overwhelming. Camilla had claimed to have established a scholarship fund for underprivileged children in the early 2000s. The fund had never existed, though money had been donated by well-meaning supporters who believed they were contributing to a legitimate cause. She had spoken eloquently about her work with domestic violence victims, complete with touching anecdotes about women she had supposedly helped. The women didn't exist, and the shelters she claimed to have supported had no record of her involvement. Perhaps most damning of all were the revelations about her relationship with Prince Charles during his marriage to Diana. Camilla had spent years reshaping that narrative, portraying herself as someone who had stepped away respectfully and only reconnected with Charles after his marriage had already failed. The evidence suggested a very different story, one of deliberate manipulation and calculated persistence that painted her in a far less sympathetic light. Sarah checked her watch. In a few hours, she would be at the charity gala as an accredited journalist. She had already submitted her story to her editor, with instructions to publish online at exactly 9 p.m., right in the middle of the evening's festivities. The timing was deliberate. She wanted Camilla to be surrounded by the very people she had deceived when the truth finally came to light. Back at Clarence's house, Camilla was reviewing her speech for the evening. She took pride in her public speaking, having worked hard over the years to project warmth and sincerity. Tonight's speech was particularly important because it would focus on the importance of honesty and integrity in charitable work, words that would soon take on a bitter irony. Her assistant, Margaret, bustled around the room making final preparations. Margaret had been with Camilla for over 15 years and had become fiercely protective of her employer's reputation. What Margaret didn't know was that she had unknowingly been part of the deception, helping to coordinate events and meetings that Camilla later fabricated into grander stories of charitable accomplishment. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, "the car will be ready at 6:30. The schedule has you arriving at 7 for the reception, with your speech at 8:15. Camilla nodded absently, her mind already on the evening ahead. She had mastered the art of working a room, of making each person feel that their conversation with her was meaningful and personal. It was a skill that had served her well in rebuilding her public image, and she planned to deploy it fully tonight. "Has there been any unusual media interest?" Camilla asked, a habit born from years of carefully managing her public appearances. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Your Majesty. The usual royal correspondents will be there, along with some lifestyle and charity publication journalists. All very routine." If Margaret had looked more carefully at the media list, she might have noticed Sarah Mitchell's name and recognized it as belonging to one of Britain's most tenacious investigative reporters. But the name meant nothing to her, and the evening proceeded according to plan. At Kensington Palace, William was making his own preparations. He had decided to attend the gala, despite not being originally scheduled to do so. His presence would add weight to whatever unfolded, and he found himself curious to see how Camilla would react when her carefully constructed world began to collapse. He thought about his mother, about the pain she had endured during those final years when the truth about his father's relationship with Camilla had been an open secret. Diana had been vilified by some for speaking out about the affair, painted as unstable and vindictive. Now, with the full scope of Camilla's deceptions laid bare, William wondered how different the public narrative might have been if his mother had lived to see this day. The irony was profound. Camilla had spent decades crafting an image of herself as a woman of integrity who had been misunderstood and unfairly maligned. She had positioned herself as someone who understood the importance of truth and transparency, someone who had learned from past mistakes and grown into a role model for others. The reality, as the evidence clearly showed, was that she had become increasingly sophisticated in her deceptions, not reformed from them. William's phone buzzed with a text from Harry. "Are you really going through with this?" He typed back, "The truth deserves to be heard." As evening approached, London's social elite began making their way to the grand ballroom where the charity gala would take place. The event was one of the highlights of the social calendar, combining serious fundraising for worthy causes with the glamour and prestige that came with royal patronage. Many of the attendees had personal relationships with Camilla, having worked with her on various charitable initiatives over the years. What none of them knew was that they were about to become unwitting witnesses to one of the most spectacular falls from grace in modern royal history. The investigative report had been meticulously compiled over months of careful research. Every claim had been verified through multiple sources, every document authenticated by experts. Sarah Mitchell had learned from past scandals about the importance of ironclad evidence when taking on such a powerful target. She knew that Camilla's supporters would initially dismiss the allegations as malicious gossip or politically motivated attacks. The evidence would need to be so comprehensive, so undeniable, that even the most loyal defenders would be forced to acknowledge the truth. As guests began arriving at the venue, there was an air of anticipation that none of them could quite explain. Perhaps it was the unexpected announcement that Prince William would be attending, or maybe it was the unusual amount of media attention the event seemed to be generating. Whatever the cause, there was an electricity in the air that suggested this would be an evening to remember. Camilla arrived precisely on schedule, stepping out of her official car with the practiced grace she had perfected over years of public appearances. She wore an elegant navy dress with her signature pearls, an ensemble chosen to project authority while remaining approachable. The photographers captured her warm smile and confident bearing, images that would later serve as a stark contrast to what was to come. She worked the reception with her usual skill, moving from group to group with apparent ease. She listened attentively to updates on various charitable projects, offered encouragement to young fundraisers, and charmed longtime supporters with personal anecdotes about her work. To all appearances, she was exactly what she claimed to be, a dedicated royal consort committed to making a positive difference in the world. But beneath the surface, the foundation of lies that supported her entire public persona was about to be exposed in the most public way possible. The evening that had been planned as a celebration of charitable achievement was about to become something else entirely, a reckoning that would leave everyone in attendance questioning everything they thought they knew about the woman they had come to respect and admire. As 8 o'clock approached, and the formal program was about to begin, Sarah Mitchell took her seat in the media section and opened her laptop. Her editor had confirmed that the story was ready for publication at exactly 9 p.m. In just 1 hour, the carefully constructed image that Camilla had spent decades building would begin its very public collapse. The stage was set for a revelation that would send shockwaves through the royal family and beyond, leaving Prince William struggling to contain his amusement as he watched years of careful image management unravel in real time before an audience of hundreds of influential witnesses. The grand ballroom buzzed with conversation as guests took their seats for the evening's program. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in cream silk, each adorned with elegant centerpieces featuring white roses and royal blue accents. The cream of British society had gathered, politicians, celebrities, business leaders, and philanthropists who had supported Camilla's various charitable endeavors over the years. Prince William entered the ballroom at precisely 8 o'clock, his unexpected presence causing a subtle stir among the attendees. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting familiar faces while his eyes occasionally drifted to where Camilla stood near the main stage, reviewing her notes one final time. She looked confident, even radiant, completely unaware that her world was about to change forever. Lord Peterson, chairman of the Children's Education Trust, approached William with obvious pleasure. "Your Royal Highness, what a wonderful surprise to see you here tonight. Her Majesty has been such an inspiration to our organization. The scholarship program she helped establish has already changed the lives of over 200 children." William smiled politely, though something flickered behind his eyes. "Yes, I'm very interested to hear more about that program tonight." He knew, of course, that the scholarship program Peterson referenced was one of the fabrications detailed in the investigative report. The money had been raised, certainly, but it had never reached any children. Instead, it had been quietly redirected through a complex series of transactions that ultimately benefited organizations with ties to Camilla's personal interests. Lady Hamilton, a prominent society figure who had worked closely with Camilla on literacy initiatives, joined their conversation. "Prince William, I don't know if you're aware, but your stepmother has been absolutely transformational for our reading program. The way she connected with those children in Birmingham last month was extraordinary. Several of them told me it was the first time they felt truly heard by an adult." Again, William nodded with apparent interest, though he was well aware that Camilla's much-publicized visit to Birmingham had lasted exactly 45 minutes, with most of that time spent in photo opportunities. The touching stories about personal connections with individual children had been crafted by her publicity team, complete with carefully coached testimonials from adults who had been paid to provide heartwarming quotes about her impact. As guests settled into their seats, Sarah Mitchell checked her watch once more. 47 minutes until publication. She had spent the reception moving quietly through the crowd, observing interactions and taking notes. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. She was surrounded by good people who genuinely believed in the charitable work they were supporting, completely unaware that their admiration was based on carefully constructed lies. Dr. Rebecca Chun, who ran a women's shelter in East London, had cornered Camilla near the stage to express her gratitude. "Your Majesty, I cannot thank you enough for your personal support during our darkest period last year. When funding was cut, and we thought we might have to close, your intervention made all the difference. The women we serve will never forget what you did for them." Camilla smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on Dr. Chen's arm. "Rebecca, you know how deeply I care about this work. Those women needed our help, and I simply couldn't stand by and watch the shelter close. Her voice carried exactly the right note of humble sincerity, the tone she had perfected over years of practice. What Dr. Chin didn't know was that Camilla had never actually provided any funding to the shelter. The money that had saved the organization had come from an anonymous donor who had been moved by news coverage of their plight. Camilla had simply allowed the shelter's staff to believe she was responsible, accepting their gratitude while never explicitly claiming credit. It was a perfect example of her sophisticated approach to deception, technically not lying, but deliberately fostering false beliefs that enhanced her reputation. The evening's master of ceremonies, veteran broadcaster James Morrison, stepped to the podium to begin the formal program. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this year's Royal Charity Gala. Tonight we celebrate not just the worthy causes that bring us together, but the extraordinary leadership that has made tonight's successes possible. As Morrison spoke, William noticed his father arriving late, slipping into a seat at the royal table with his usual understated presence. Prince Charles looked tired, and William wondered if he had any idea what was about to unfold. Over the past few months, there had been subtle signs that his father was beginning to have his own doubts about some of Camilla's stories, particularly when details didn't align with his own memories of events. Our first speaker tonight represents an organization that has truly transformed the lives of vulnerable young people across the United Kingdom, Morrison continued. The Hope Foundation has grown from a small local initiative to a national movement, thanks in large part to the passionate advocacy of our patron, Her Majesty Queen Camilla. Marcus Thompson, director of the Hope Foundation, approached the podium with evident emotion. He was a genuine man who had devoted his life to helping at-risk youth, and his admiration for Camilla appeared completely sincere. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highnesses, distinguished guests, I stand before you tonight humbled by the opportunity to share what extraordinary leadership can accomplish. Thompson launched into a detailed account of the Foundation's work, repeatedly crediting Camilla with crucial interventions at key moments. He described her hands-on involvement with program development, her personal mentoring of young people, and her innovative fundraising strategies that had enabled the organization to expand rapidly. Sarah Mitchell typed notes furiously as she listened. Every accomplishment Thompson attributed to Camilla was documented in her investigation as either completely false or grossly exaggerated. The Foundation had indeed grown dramatically, but due to the dedicated work of staff members like Thompson himself, along with funding from sources that had nothing to do with Camilla, she had simply attached herself to their success, gradually inserting herself into their narrative until people genuinely believed she had been instrumental in their achievements. 3 years ago, when we were struggling to secure funding for our Manchester branch, Thompson continued, his voice growing more passionate, Her Majesty didn't just offer financial support. She personally called potential donors, sharing her vision for what we could accomplish together. That branch now serves over 400 young people annually. In the audience, several guests nodded approvingly, many having heard similar stories about Camilla's behind-the-scenes efforts. They had no way of knowing that the Manchester branch had been funded through a government grant that Camilla had nothing to do with securing, and that the personal calls to donors had never actually taken place. The story had become part of the Foundation's internal mythology, repeated so often that even Thompson genuinely believed it. As Thompson concluded his remarks to enthusiastic applause, Morrison returned to introduce the evening's keynote speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to introduce someone who needs no introduction to this audience. Her Majesty has transformed the landscape of charitable giving in this country through her unwavering commitment to causes that matter most. Please join me in welcoming Her Majesty Queen Camilla. The applause was warm and sustained as Camilla rose from her seat and walked to the podium. She moved with confidence, pausing to acknowledge familiar faces in the audience with small nods and smiles. When she reached the microphone, she waited for the applause to die down before beginning to speak. Thank you so much for that generous welcome, she began, her voice carrying easily through the ballroom. And thank you, Marcus, for those kind words about work that has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. She paused, looking out over the assembled guests with apparent sincerity. You know, when I first became involved in charitable work, I had no idea how profoundly it would change me. I thought I would be the one giving, the one helping others. I never expected that I would receive so much more than I could ever hope to give. The speech was masterfully delivered, hitting all the right notes of humility, gratitude, and inspiration. Camilla spoke about the importance of authentic connection and charitable work, about the responsibility that comes with privilege, and about the transformational power of genuine compassion. She shared what appeared to be personal anecdotes about individuals she had met through her various charitable endeavors, painting vivid pictures of human connections that had supposedly shaped her understanding of service. I remember meeting Sarah, a young mother who had been living in her car with her 3 children, Camilla said, her voice taking on a more intimate tone. She was too proud to ask for help, but I could see the fear in her eyes when she thought about what would happen if winter came, and she still had no home for her family. That conversation changed everything for me. It made me realize that charity isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about seeing the person in front of you and finding a way to let them know they matter. The audience was completely engaged, many visibly moved by the story. Several people wiped away tears, touched by what seemed to be a genuine moment of human connection. They had no way of knowing that Sarah was a composite character created from various case studies that Camilla's staff had compiled, or that the touching conversation had never actually taken place. As Camilla continued speaking, Sarah Mitchell glanced at her watch again. 23 minutes until publication. She looked around the ballroom, taking in the faces of people who were hanging on every word, completely convinced they were hearing from someone who embodied the best of public service. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. She was watching hundreds of intelligent, successful people being systematically deceived by someone who had elevated lying to an art form. The work we do together isn't just about the money we raise or the programs we fund, Camilla continued. It's about the message we send to people who have lost hope. When we show up, when we pay attention, when we refuse to look away from suffering, we're telling them that their lives have value, that their struggles matter, that they are not forgotten. Prince William listened to these words with a mixture of fascination and disgust. The woman speaking was either a brilliant actress or had genuinely convinced herself that her fabricated stories were real. Either possibility was deeply troubling. He thought about the real people who had been helped by the various organizations represented in the room tonight. People whose stories had been co-opted and sanitized to enhance Camilla's image. People who had no idea they had become unwitting props in an elaborate performance. I want to share something with you that I've never spoken about publicly before, Camilla said, her voice dropping slightly as if she was about to reveal something deeply personal. Last Christmas, I received a letter from a woman named Elizabeth. She wrote to tell me that our literacy program had taught her to read at the age of 67. Can you imagine? For 67 years, she had hidden her illiteracy, too ashamed to ask for help. In her letter, she said that learning to read had given her back her dignity. The audience was completely silent, absorbed in what appeared to be a profoundly moving story. Camilla's voice grew stronger as she continued. Elizabeth wrote that she had always felt stupid, that she had spent her entire life pretending to understand things she couldn't read. She had missed out on helping her children with homework, on reading bedtime stories to her grandchildren, on fully participating in a world that assumes literacy. When she finally learned to read, she said it was like discovering she had been living in black and white, and suddenly, the world was in color. Several people in the audience were now openly crying, moved by this story of late-life transformation and dignity restored. They had no way of knowing that while literacy programs did indeed help many older adults, Elizabeth was entirely fictional. The letter Camilla described had never been written, and the touching details about homework and bedtime stories had been crafted by her speechwriting team to maximize emotional impact. Elizabeth's letter reminded me why we do this work, Camilla concluded. It's not about recognition or credit or having our names on buildings. It's about the moment when someone realizes they matter, when they discover they have value, when they understand that it's never too late to change their story. The applause that followed was thunderous, a standing ovation that went on for nearly 3 minutes. People were genuinely moved, inspired by what they believed was an authentic account of compassionate service. As Camilla basked in the adulation, acknowledging the applause with gracious nods and smiles, Sarah Mitchell prepared for what she knew would be the most dramatic moment of her career. 15 minutes until publication. As the applause finally died down and guests began to return to their seats, Morrison returned to the podium to introduce the evening's final speaker before dinner would be served. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more very special presentation tonight. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't listening anymore. Her focus was entirely on her laptop screen, finger hovering over the publish button as she waited for exactly 9 o'clock. In her other hand, she held her phone, ready to alert the major news networks that the story was live. What was about to happen would transform this elegant charity gala into the epicenter of one of the biggest royal scandals in modern history. Sarah Mitchell's finger hovered over the publish button as the clock on her laptop displayed 8:59 p.m. Around her, the elegant charity gala continued in blissful ignorance, with guests beginning to shift their attention toward the dinner portion of the evening. Servers moved quietly between tables, filling water glasses and making final preparations for the meal service. The atmosphere remained warm and celebratory, with many people still discussing the emotional impact of Camilla's speech. At exactly 9 o'clock, Sarah pressed publish. Within seconds, her exposé began appearing on news websites across the internet. The headline was stark and devastating. Queen Camilla's charitable empire built on lies. Exclusive investigation reveals decades of deception. Below it, a subtitle that would soon be repeated across social media: fabricated programs, forged documents, and fictional beneficiaries. How the Queen Consort created a false legacy. The story was comprehensive and methodical, beginning with a detailed breakdown of Camilla's most frequently cited charitable accomplishments. Each claim was presented alongside the evidence that debunked it. Photos that had been doctored to place Camilla at events she had never attended. Testimonials from supposed beneficiaries who didn't exist. Financial records showing that money raised for specific causes had been diverted to other purposes entirely. But the investigation went deeper than simple charity fraud. It revealed a pattern of behavior that stretched back decades, showing how Camilla had systematically constructed a false identity to gain acceptance in royal circles and British society. Her supposed transformation from controversial figure to beloved queen consort had been built on a foundation of carefully crafted lies. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, the first people to notice something was wrong were those checking their phones during the brief lull before dinner service. Lady Margaret Thornton, a prominent supporter of children's charities who had worked closely with Camilla for years, gasped audibly as she read the breaking news alert that had just appeared on her screen. "This can't be right," she whispered to her husband, Lord Thornton, showing him her phone. "They're saying that Camilla has been lying about her charitable work for years." Lord Thornton's face paled as he scanned the article. As a former journalist himself, he could recognize the hallmarks of serious investigative reporting. This wasn't tabloid gossip or malicious speculation. It was a carefully documented exposé with the kind of evidence that would be very difficult to refute. Across the room, similar conversations were beginning to break out as more people discovered the story. The news was spreading with the viral intensity that only comes with truly shocking revelations. Social media algorithms, designed to amplify engaging content, were pushing the story to millions of users within minutes of publication. Dr. Rebecca Chun, who had expressed such heartfelt gratitude to Camilla earlier in the evening, stared at her phone in disbelief. According to the investigation, Camilla had never provided any funding to her women's shelter. The anonymous donation that had saved her organization had come from an entirely different source, and Camilla had simply allowed the misconception to persist. Chun felt a sick feeling in the pit of her stomach as she realized she had been unknowingly participating in an elaborate deception. Prince William, who had been monitoring the situation carefully, noticed the subtle change in atmosphere before most people were consciously aware of it. Conversations were becoming more hushed and urgent. People were huddling together, sharing their phones, and whispering with increasing intensity. He watched as comprehension dawned on face after face, expressions shifting from confusion to shock to something approaching anger. At the royal table, Prince Charles remained unaware of the unfolding crisis. He was engaged in conversation with the Archbishop of Canterbury about upcoming royal events, his attention focused entirely on the discussion at hand. William debated whether to alert his father immediately or wait to see how events developed. He decided to wait, curious to see how long it would take for news of the investigation to reach the royal table. Camilla herself was still basking in the afterglow of her successful speech, moving between tables to greet guests personally. She was completely oblivious to the digital firestorm that was beginning to engulf her reputation. Her practiced charm was on full display as she thanked people for their support and listened to their own charitable initiatives. She had perfected the art of making each interaction feel meaningful and personal, a skill that had served her well in rebuilding her public image over the years. "Your Majesty," said Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who ran a small animal rescue charity, "your speech tonight was absolutely beautiful. The story about Elizabeth learning to read, it brought tears to my eyes." "Thank you so much, Mrs. Patterson, Camilla replied warmly. Stories like Elizabeth's remind me why this work is so important. When we can make a real difference in someone's life, everything else fades away. What neither woman knew was that even as they spoke, news organizations around the world were picking up Sarah Mitchell's investigation. The BBC had already begun preparing a special report, while Sky News was organizing an emergency panel discussion. In the United States, CNN and other major networks were alerting their royal correspondents to prepare for what was clearly going to be a major story. The speed with which the news spread was remarkable even by modern standards. Within 30 minutes of publication, hashtags related to the investigation were trending on multiple social media platforms. Hashtag Camilla Lies, hashtag Royal Deception, and hashtag Charity Fraud were being shared thousands of times per minute as people around the world discovered the shocking allegations against the Queen Consort. Marcus Thompson, the director of the Hope Foundation who had spoken so passionately about Camilla's support earlier in the evening, was one of the first to confront the full implications of what was being revealed. As he read through the detailed breakdown of his organization's supposed connection to Camilla, he realized that nearly everything he had believed about her involvement was false. The investigation revealed that Camilla had never personally called donors on behalf of the Manchester branch, had never provided the crucial funding he had credited her with, and had never been involved in the program development he had described. Worse yet, some of the stories he had been told about her personal mentoring of young people appeared to have been completely fabricated by her staff to create the impression of hands-on involvement that simply didn't exist. Thompson felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just on his own behalf, but on behalf of the young people his organization served. Their genuine stories of transformation and growth had been co-opted to enhance Camilla's image, turning real human experiences into props in an elaborate performance. He thought about all the times he had publicly praised her supposed contributions, unknowingly participating in what he now realized was a systematic deception. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the ballroom became increasingly surreal. A significant portion of the guests were now aware of the breaking story, but the formal dinner service continued as planned. Servers presented the first course while hundreds of people struggled to process what they were learning about the woman they had gathered to honor. Sarah Mitchell watched the scene unfold with fascination. She had covered many major stories throughout her career, but she had never witnessed such a dramatic collision between public perception and hidden reality. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. People were sitting in a room decorated in honor of Camilla's charitable work while simultaneously discovering that much of that work had never actually happened. Lady Hamilton, who had worked closely with Camilla on literacy programs, was among those struggling to reconcile what she was reading with her own experiences. According to the investigation, many of the success stories she had heard Camilla tell were either heavily embellished or completely fictional. The touching anecdotes about personal connections with individual learners appeared to have been crafted by speechwriters rather than drawn from real interactions. "How is this possible?" she asked her dinner companion, a fellow literacy advocate. "I've worked with her for years. I've seen her dedication firsthand." But, as Lady Hamilton thought more carefully about her experiences, troubling details began to emerge in her memory. She realized that she had never actually witnessed Camilla interacting directly with program participants for extended periods. Their meetings had always been carefully orchestrated affairs with brief, supervised interactions that could be easily managed and controlled. The heartwarming stories about deeper connections had always come secondhand, usually from Camilla's staff members. Prince William observed the unfolding drama with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. While he felt vindicated that the truth was finally being revealed, he was also aware of the broader implications for the royal family. This scandal would inevitably reflect on the institution as a whole, raising questions about how such extensive deception could have gone undetected for so long. He also felt a growing sense of dark amusement at the irony of the situation. Here was Camilla, still working the room and accepting congratulations for her charitable accomplishments, completely unaware that her entire public persona was crumbling in real time. The woman who had spent decades carefully managing her image was about to discover that in the digital age, reputation could be destroyed as quickly as it could be built. At approximately 9:45 p.m., the news finally reached the royal table in an unexpected way. The Archbishop of Canterbury's aide approached him discreetly and whispered something urgent in his ear. The Archbishop's face went ashen as he listened, and he immediately turned to Prince Charles with obvious distress. "Your Royal Highness," the Archbishop said quietly, I'm afraid there's been a rather serious development that requires your immediate attention. Prince Charles looked puzzled, his attention still partially focused on their previous conversation. What sort of development? The Archbishop hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with having to deliver such news in a public setting. Sir, there's been a major news story published about Her Majesty. I think it would be best if we could speak privately. But, before Charles could respond, his own phone buzzed with an urgent message from his private secretary. As he read the brief summary of what was being reported, his face went through a rapid succession of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and, finally, a sort of weary resignation that suggested this wasn't entirely unexpected. William watched his father's reaction carefully, trying to gauge whether Charles was genuinely surprised by the allegations or whether he had harbored his own doubts about Camilla's stories. The older man's response seemed to suggest the latter, less shock than a painful confirmation of suspicions he had perhaps been trying to ignore. Meanwhile, Camilla continued her rounds of the dining room, still completely oblivious to the crisis that was engulfing her. She was engaged in animated conversation with a group of young charity workers, sharing what appeared to be spontaneous anecdotes about her experiences in the field. The contrast between her confident demeanor and the reality of what was being revealed online was becoming almost surreal. The key thing to remember, she was saying to the young activists, is that authentic charitable work isn't about publicity or recognition. It's about genuine human connection, about seeing people as individuals rather than statistics. When you approach this work with real humility and openness, the impact you can have is extraordinary. The bitter irony of these words, spoken even as evidence of her extensive deceptions spread across the internet, was not lost on the growing number of guests who were now aware of the investigation. Some were beginning to look at her with expressions of barely concealed disgust, while others seemed to be studying her as if seeing her for the first time. As 10 o'clock approached, it became clear that the story was not going to remain contained within the sphere of online news and social media. Television news programs were beginning to interrupt their regular programming with breaking news alerts about the investigation. The scandal was rapidly escalating from a digital phenomenon to a full-scale media crisis. The moment when Camilla would finally learn about the exposé was approaching, and everyone in the ballroom who was aware of the situation seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how she would react when her carefully constructed world finally came crashing down around her. The moment of reckoning came at exactly 10:17 p.m., and it arrived in the most mundane way possible. Camilla's personal assistant, Margaret, who had been monitoring social media and news alerts as part of her routine duties, finally saw the devastating headlines that had been dominating the internet for over an hour. Her face drained of all color as she read the opening paragraphs of Sarah Mitchell's investigation. Margaret's hands trembled as she scrolled through the evidence that systematically dismantled everything she thought she knew about her employer. The woman she had loyally served for 15 years, whom she had genuinely admired for her dedication to charitable causes, was being revealed as an elaborate fraud. Worse yet, Margaret realized that she had unwittingly been complicit in many of the deceptions, helping to coordinate fake events and fabricated meetings that Camilla had later transformed into inspiring anecdotes. The assistant faced an impossible choice: interrupt Camilla's ongoing conversations with guests to deliver news that would destroy her evening, or wait until they returned to Clarence House to break the devastating revelations privately. Margaret's training told her to wait, to handle the crisis away from public eyes. But, as she watched more and more guests checking their phones with expressions of shock and disgust, she realized that delay was no longer an option. With leaden steps, Margaret approached the table where Camilla was holding court with a group of international charity representatives. The Queen Consort was in the middle of an animated story about a supposedly impromptu visit to a homeless shelter, complete with touching details about individual conversations she claimed to have had with residents. "Your Majesty," Margaret interrupted as quietly as possible, "I'm terribly sorry, but there's an urgent matter that requires your immediate attention." Camilla looked slightly annoyed at the interruption, but maintained her composed smile for the benefit of her audience. "I'm sure it can wait just a few more minutes, Margaret. We're having such a lovely conversation about the importance of authentic engagement and charitable work." "Ma'am, I really must insist," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying an urgency that couldn't be ignored. "It's a matter of some considerable importance." Something in Margaret's tone finally penetrated Camilla's consciousness. She excused herself graciously from the group, promising to return shortly to continue their discussion. As they moved to a relatively quiet corner of the ballroom, Margaret handed Camilla her phone with the news article displayed. "Ma'am, this was published about an hour ago. It's everywhere." Camilla took the phone with casual confidence, expecting to see some minor piece of gossip or perhaps a positive review of her speech. As she read the headline, her expression didn't change immediately. It was as if her brain couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Queen Camilla's charitable empire built on lies. Exclusive investigation reveals decades of deception. She scrolled down to read the opening paragraphs, and slowly, very slowly, the color began to drain from her face. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor that spread across her features as the full scope of the investigation became clear. Every fabricated story, every exaggerated claim, every fictional beneficiary was laid out in devastating detail. This is impossible," she whispered, more to herself than to Margaret. Where did they get? But, even as she spoke, Camilla knew that denial was futile. The investigation was too thorough, too well documented to be dismissed as malicious gossip. Someone had spent months, perhaps years, meticulously uncovering the truth about her carefully constructed charitable persona. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Prince William, who had been watching for this moment, felt a complex mix of emotions as he observed Camilla's reaction from across the room. There was satisfaction in seeing the truth finally revealed, but also a strange sort of pity for someone whose entire identity was crumbling in such a public setting. He could see the exact moment when the full implications hit her, not just the immediate embarrassment, but the long-term destruction of everything she had spent decades building. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The confident, charismatic woman who had been commanding the room just moments before seemed to physically shrink as she continued reading. Her shoulders sagged, her composed posture collapsed, and, for the first time in years, she looked her actual age rather than the carefully maintained image she usually projected. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should consider leaving," Margaret suggested quietly. "The car is still available, and we could." But Camilla wasn't listening. She was scrolling through the article with increasing desperation, perhaps hoping to find some error or misinterpretation that could provide a pathway to recovery. Instead, she found section after section of meticulously documented deception. The scholarship program that had never existed. The literacy initiative that was entirely fictional. The international development work that consisted only of photo opportunities and press releases. What made the revelation particularly devastating was how comprehensive it was. This wasn't an attack on one or two questionable claims, but a systematic demolition of her entire charitable identity. Every story she had told, every accomplishment she had claimed, every touching anecdote about helping individuals in need, all of it was being revealed as elaborate fiction. Around the ballroom, the atmosphere had become increasingly uncomfortable as more guests became aware of the unfolding scandal. Conversations had taken on a strained quality, with people struggling to maintain social pleasantries while processing the shocking revelations about their host. Some guests were beginning to make quiet excuses and leave early, unwilling to remain at an event that was rapidly becoming the epicenter of a major scandal. Dr. Rebecca Chun, still reeling from the discovery that her gratitude to Camilla had been based on false premises, watched the Queen Consort's reaction with a mixture of anger and something approaching sympathy. Despite her own sense of betrayal, she couldn't help but feel disturbed by the public nature of Camilla's humiliation. This was a human being whose life was being destroyed in real time before hundreds of witnesses. But other guests were less charitable in their reactions. Lord Peterson, whose children's education trust had unknowingly participated in one of Camilla's fabricated programs, felt a rising sense of outrage as he read the details of how his organization's genuine work had been co-opted for false narratives. The money they had raised believing they were supporting Camilla's scholarship initiative had been diverted to other purposes entirely, while she claimed credit for their efforts. "She's been using us," Peterson said to his wife with barely contained fury. "All of us. Using our genuine work, our real accomplishments, as props for her elaborate performance." Similar conversations were breaking out across the ballroom as people began to understand the full scope of what had been done to them. They weren't just victims of lies about Camilla's charitable work. They were unwitting accomplices who had been manipulated into providing credibility for her deceptions. Their genuine dedication to helping others had been exploited to enhance the reputation of someone who appeared to care about nothing but her own image. Prince Charles, meanwhile, sat at the royal table looking older than his years. The aide who had brought him the initial news had provided a more detailed briefing, and the implications were staggering. This wasn't just a scandal about charitable fraud. It was a fundamental crisis of trust that struck at the heart of the monarchy's relationship with the British public. How could the institution have failed to detect such extensive deception from someone so close to the throne? "Father," William said quietly, approaching the royal table, "perhaps we should discuss how to handle this situation." Charles looked up at his son with an expression of weary defeat. "Handle it? William, I'm not sure this is something that can be handled. The evidence appears to be rather conclusive." For the first time in years, the two men were in complete agreement. This wasn't a crisis that could be managed through careful public relations or strategic messaging. The documentation was too comprehensive, the evidence too damning to explain away. This would require fundamental acknowledgement of wrongdoing and consequences that neither of them was prepared to contemplate. Across the room, Camilla had finished reading the investigation and stood frozen in place, still holding Margaret's phone. The magnitude of her situation was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just a news story that would fade after a few days of coverage. This was the complete destruction of the identity she had spent decades constructing, revealed in excruciating detail to a global audience. "Ma'am," Margaret said again, more urgently this time, "we really should consider leaving. The situation is only going to become more difficult." But, as Camilla looked around the ballroom, she realized that leaving might actually make things worse. The guests who were still unaware of the investigation would soon discover it regardless, and her sudden departure would only add to the appearance of guilt and cowardice. She was trapped in a room full of people she had systematically deceived, with nowhere to hide, and no plausible way to deny the evidence against her. It was at this moment that Prince William's amusement finally broke through his royal composure. The sheer audacity of the woman's deceptions, combined with the poetic justice of having them exposed in this particular setting, struck him as almost comically perfect. Here was someone who had built her entire reputation on fabricated compassion and fictional charitable work, being exposed in a room full of people who genuinely cared about helping others. His quiet laughter started as barely more than a suppressed chuckle, but it grew as he contemplated the beautiful irony of the situation. The woman who had spent years crafting tear-jerking stories about her charitable work was about to become the subject of very real tears, tears of anger and betrayal from people whose trust she had systematically exploited. James Morrison, the evening's master of ceremonies, had also become aware of the crisis and faced an unprecedented dilemma. The formal program called for closing remarks and thank you speeches, but continuing with the planned agenda while such devastating revelations circulated seemed impossible. Yet abruptly ending the event would create additional chaos and potentially make the situation even more embarrassing for everyone involved. Sarah Mitchell watched the unfolding drama with professional fascination and personal satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of accountability moment that made investigative journalism worthwhile. After months of painstaking research, documentation, and verification, she was witnessing the real-time impact of truth-telling. The discomfort was palpable, but necessary. These people had a right to know how they had been manipulated and deceived. As 10:30 approached, it became clear that the evening could not continue as planned. Too many guests were aware of the scandal, the atmosphere had become too strained, and Camilla herself was clearly in no condition to continue playing her role as the gracious hostess. The charity gala that was supposed to celebrate her accomplishments had instead become the setting for their spectacular demolition. The question now was not whether Camilla's reputation could be salvaged, but how much additional damage would be done as the full implications of the investigation continued to unfold. And, in that moment, as William watched the woman who had caused his family so much pain finally face the consequences of her actions, his quiet laughter grew just a little bit louder. The breaking point came when Lady Victoria Ashford, one of Britain's most respected philanthropists, and a woman who had worked alongside Camilla for over a decade, stood up from her table and began walking deliberately toward where Camilla stood frozen with her phone. Lady Ashford's face was a mask of controlled fury, her usual aristocratic composure barely containing what appeared to be volcanic rage. The ballroom fell silent as guests sensed the approaching confrontation. Even those who hadn't yet discovered the news investigation could tell that something momentous was about to unfold. Conversations died mid-sentence, cutlery was set down on plates, and all attention focused on the slow-motion collision between two of the most prominent women in British charitable circles. "Camilla," Lady Ashford said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. "I think we need to have a conversation." The use of Camilla's first name, rather than the proper "Your Majesty," was deliberate and devastating. In aristocratic circles, such a breach of protocol was equivalent to a declaration of war. Lady Ashford was publicly stripping Camilla of the respect and deference she had spent years earning. "Victoria, perhaps this isn't the appropriate time or place," Camilla managed, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She was still holding Margaret's phone, the damning investigation visible on its screen like evidence at a trial. "Oh, I think this is exactly the appropriate time and place," Lady Ashford replied, her voice growing stronger. "After all, isn't this the venue where you've been telling us stories about your charitable work? Shouldn't we discuss the truth about that work while we're all gathered together?" Camilla's face went even paler, if that was possible. She could see that Lady Ashford wasn't just angry about being deceived. She was prepared to create a public scene that would ensure this moment was remembered by everyone present. The scandal wasn't going to remain a private matter to be handled through careful damage control. It was about to become a spectacle. Prince William's amusement grew more pronounced as he watched the confrontation develop. After years of watching Camilla manipulate social situations to her advantage, seeing her on the receiving end of such public judgment felt like poetic justice. He made no effort to intervene or defuse the situation. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying the show. "You told us about the literacy program," Lady Ashford continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "You brought us to tears with stories about elderly people learning to read for the first time. Elizabeth, wasn't that the name you used tonight? The woman who learned to read at 67. Camilla opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. What could she possibly say? The investigation had already revealed that Elizabeth was fictional, along with most of the other touching individual stories she had shared over the years. According to this rather thorough investigation, Lady Ashford said, pulling out her own phone, Elizabeth never existed. Neither did Sarah, the homeless mother you've mentioned so often, nor the young man from Birmingham who supposedly turned his life around with your mentoring. They were all stories, weren't they? Characters in the elaborate fiction you created about your charitable work. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Guests who hadn't yet seen the investigation were learning about it through this public confrontation, their faces showing the progression from confusion to understanding to disgust. Those who had already read the article watched with fascination as one of Camilla's most prominent supporters systematically dismantled her reputation in real time. Dr. Rebecca Chun felt tears of anger welling in her eyes as she listened. The stories Lady Ashford was referencing weren't just abstract lies. They had been told to manipulate genuine emotions, to create false connections between Camilla and the real people who benefited from charitable work. The fictional characters had been crafted to be maximally sympathetic, designed to generate the kind of emotional response that would enhance Camilla's reputation and secure continued support for her supposed initiatives. I've spent 12 years working with you, Lady Ashford continued, her voice beginning to shake with emotion. 12 years believing in your commitment, your compassion, your genuine desire to help others. I've defended you to critics, raised money based on your supposed programs, and encouraged others to support your work. And now I discover that it was all theater. Marcus Thompson, the Hope Foundation director, stood up from his own table and approached the confrontation. The genuine emotion in his voice was heartbreaking as he addressed Camilla directly. Your Majesty, I need to understand. The young people I've seen helped by our programs, their transformations were real. Their struggles, their victories, their growth, all of that was genuine. But you've been taking credit for work you had nothing to do with. How could you use their real pain and real healing as props for your own image? Camilla finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I never meant to diminish the real work. I believe deeply in the importance of charitable service. Believing in it and actually doing it are rather different things, interrupted Lord Peterson, who had also risen from his table. My organization has spent 5 years thinking we were part of your scholarship initiative. We've credited you with helping hundreds of children, told their families that their opportunities came through your personal intervention. Those children deserve to know the truth about who is actually helping them. Prince William could no longer contain his amusement. The situation was so surreal, so perfectly absurd, that his quiet chuckling became audible to those nearby. Here was the woman who had spent decades crafting the perfect royal persona, being systematically demolished by the very people she had manipulated. The irony was exquisite. His laughter caught the attention of several guests, including his father, who looked at him with a mixture of shock and disapproval. But William couldn't help himself. After years of watching Camilla's careful image management, seeing it all collapse in such spectacular fashion was genuinely amusing. The Empress had no clothes, and everyone was finally seeing her for what she really was. "You think this is funny?" Lady Ashford asked, turning toward William with surprise. The directness of her question violated every protocol of royal interaction, but the evening had already moved far beyond normal social conventions. "I think justice is often amusing," William replied, making no effort to hide his smile. "I think there's humor in watching someone who has built their entire reputation on deception finally face the truth. Don't you find it funny that we're all sitting in a room decorated in honor of charitable work that never actually happened?" The boldness of his response sent shockwaves through the assembled guests. Members of the royal family simply didn't make such statements in public, especially not about each other. But William seemed liberated by the collapse of pretense, free to express what he had apparently been thinking for years. Prince Charles looked mortified by his son's behavior, but he also appeared incapable of mounting any defense of Camilla. How could he defend someone whose deceptions had been so thoroughly documented? Instead, he sat in stunned silence, looking older and more frail than anyone had seen him in years. "This is unconscionable," declared Dr. Patricia Henley, who ran a network of women's shelters across northern England. "I've been telling donors for years about your personal commitment to our cause. I've used your supposed involvement to secure funding, to inspire volunteers, to give hope to women who desperately needed to believe that someone in power cared about their struggles. And it was all based on lies." The pain in Dr. Henley's voice was evident to everyone in the room. This wasn't just about financial fraud or public relations deception. It was about the betrayal of people who were genuinely committed to helping others. Their trust had been weaponized to serve Camilla's personal ambitions, their sincere efforts co-opted to enhance her fabricated image. Camilla seemed to shrink further into herself as the accusations mounted. She had always been skilled at managing difficult social situations, but this was beyond anything she had ever faced. There was no way to spin this, no damage control strategy that could address such comprehensive exposure. Her entire identity was being systematically dismantled by people who had every right to feel betrayed and angry. "I think," said James Morrison, finally, finding his voice as master of ceremonies, "that perhaps we should consider concluding this evening's program." But Lady Ashford wasn't finished. "No, James, I don't think we should. I think we should continue talking about this. After all, we're all here because we care about charitable work, about helping people who genuinely need support. Shouldn't we discuss what it means when someone uses that shared commitment to deceive us?" She turned back to Camilla with renewed intensity. "Do you understand what you've done? You haven't just lied about your own accomplishments. You've undermined the credibility of charitable work itself. When people discover that someone in your position has been systematically deceiving them about helping others, they become cynical about all charitable claims. You've made it harder for every legitimate charity in this room to do their work." The truth of this statement hit the room like a physical blow. Many of the guests hadn't yet considered the broader implications of Camilla's deceptions. This wasn't just about one person's reputation. It was about the damage done to public trust in charitable institutions generally. Every organization present would now have to work harder to prove their legitimacy, to overcome the suspicion that Camilla's behavior would inevitably generate. Sarah Mitchell continued to document the unfolding scene with professional fascination. This was beyond anything she had imagined when she began her investigation. She had expected denial, damage control, perhaps legal threats. She hadn't anticipated such a complete and public collapse, with Camilla's own supporters leading the charge against her. Margaret, still standing beside her employer, looked as though she wished the floor would open up and swallow her. As Camilla's personal assistant, she would inevitably be scrutinized for her role in facilitating the deceptions. She had scheduled the fake meetings, coordinated the fabricated photo opportunities, and helped maintain the elaborate calendar of fictional charitable commitments. Her own career and reputation were now in jeopardy. "Your Majesty," Margaret whispered urgently, "please, we need to leave. This situation is only going to get worse." But even as she spoke, both women knew that leaving wouldn't solve anything. The damage was already done, and it was comprehensive. Within hours, every major news organization in the world would be covering the story. The investigation would be analyzed, discussed, and debated endlessly. There would be calls for official inquiries, demands for accountability, and questions about how such extensive deception could have gone undetected for so long. Prince William's laughter had quieted to an occasional chuckle, but his amusement remained evident to anyone paying attention. He was watching the final destruction of someone who had caused his family immense pain over the years, and he was clearly enjoying every moment of it. The woman who had manipulated her way into the royal family was finally facing consequences for her actions. As the confrontation continued, with more guests joining in to express their own sense of betrayal and outrage, it became clear that this was more than just a scandal. It was a moment of reckoning that would fundamentally change how the British public viewed the royal family and charitable institutions generally. The night that was supposed to celebrate charitable achievement had instead become a powerful reminder of the importance of truth, transparency, and genuine accountability. And at the center of it all sat Camilla, the woman whose lies had finally been revealed, facing the consequences of decades of deception while hundreds of witnesses watched her carefully constructed world crumble around her. The applause that had greeted her earlier in the evening seemed like a distant memory as she confronted the reality that her reputation, her legacy, and her future had all been destroyed by the truth she had spent so long trying to hide.